Subscribe to Storylab for more stories. Now let's begin this one. Chapter 1. The Perfect Life. Hugo Pierce adjusted his tie in the bathroom mirror, studying the reflection of a man who had learned to hide in plain sight. At 42, he possessed the kind of calm confidence that came from surviving things most people only saw in nightmares. His dark hair showed distinguished streaks of silver, and his steel-gray eyes held depths that his wife Elena had never bothered to explore. "Honey, you're going to be late for the board meeting," Elena called from their bedroom, her voice carrying that familiar note of practiced concern. Hugo smiled at his reflection. After 10 years of marriage, Elena Osborne Pierce still believed she was married to a simple construction company owner. She had no idea that the man who kissed her goodbye each morning had once been one of the most effective covert operatives in modern history. The Pierce Construction Company occupied a gleaming 30-story building in downtown Chicago. Hugo had built the business from nothing after retiring from his previous life, using skills that his competitors couldn't even comprehend. Strategic thinking, risk assessment, reading people, these weren't just business tools for Hugo. They were survival instincts honed through years of operations that officially never happened. Mr. Pierce, his assistant Rebecca Lamb nodded as he entered the executive suite. "The quarterly reports are on your desk, and your 2 p.m. with the city planning committee has been moved to 3:30. Hugo nodded, settling into his chair with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years moving through shadows. The construction business had been more than just a cover. It had become his masterpiece. Pierce Construction didn't just build buildings. They built fortresses, safe houses, and structures that served purposes far beyond their apparent function. His phone buzzed with a text from Elena. "Don't forget we're having dinner with Daddy tonight. He's excited to see you." Hugo's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Samuel Connell, Elena's father, had always made him uncomfortable. The man claimed to own several import businesses, but Hugo's trained eye had cataloged details that painted a different picture. The expensive suits that couldn't quite hide old knife scars, the way conversations stopped when he entered rooms, the subtle deference of supposedly successful businessmen who were clearly subordinates. But Hugo had played the role of the oblivious son-in-law perfectly. He laughed at Samuel's jokes, accepted his patronizing advice about business, and never let on that he could read the man like an open book. It was a performance that had taken considerable restraint, especially during family gatherings when Samuel's associates would show up with poorly concealed weapons and the kind of nervous energy that comes from a life of violence. The afternoon meeting with the city planning committee went smoothly. Hugo's latest project, a seemingly unremarkable warehouse complex on the outskirts of the city, had been approved months ago, but today's discussion centered on some minor permit adjustments. What the committee didn't know was that this warehouse had been designed with specifications that would make a military engineer proud. As Hugo drove home to the Gold Coast mansion he shared with Elena, he reflected on the careful balance of his double life. The construction business provided the perfect cover for acquiring materials, equipment, and expertise that might otherwise raise questions. Over the years, he had built a network of contractors, suppliers, and specialists who knew how to be discreet and ask no questions. Elena was waiting in their marble-adorned foyer, looking stunning in a black dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, and her blue eyes sparkled with an affection that Hugo had long since learned to question. "How was your day, darling?" she asked, rising on her toes to kiss his cheek. "Productive," Hugo replied, studying her face with the kind of attention that had once been used to detect lies that could get him killed. "Yours?" "Oh, the usual. Lunch with the girls, some shopping." Elena's smile was perfect, practiced. "Daddy's so looking forward to tonight. He says he has some exciting business opportunities to discuss with you." Hugo nodded, keeping his expression neutral. Samuel Connell's business opportunities were always carefully disguised attempts to either compromise Hugo or draw him into the family's less legitimate enterprises. So far, Hugo had managed to deflect these overtures with a combination of apparent naivety and careful misdirection. As they prepared to leave for dinner, Hugo caught Elena's reflection in the hallway mirror. For just a moment, when she thought he wasn't looking, her expression shifted. The loving wife mask slipped, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. It was a look Hugo recognized from his past life, the expression of someone planning violence. Chapter 2. Ghosts and Foundations. Hugo Pierce hadn't always been a construction magnate. 15 years earlier, he had been something else entirely, something that didn't officially exist. Operation Nightfall had been his final mission, a deep-cover infiltration of an international arms trafficking network that had taken 3 years to complete. Hugo had become someone else so completely that he'd almost forgotten his real name. When it was over, when the network was destroyed and its leaders were either dead or in maximum security prisons, Hugo had been offered a choice: accept a promotion to a desk job or disappear forever. He chose to disappear. The government had been generous with their ghost. A new identity, enough money to start over, and most importantly, the promise that Hugo Pierce would never officially exist in any database that mattered. He was a man without a past, free to build whatever future he chose. Chicago had called to him for reasons he couldn't quite articulate. Maybe it was the city's reputation for reinvention, or maybe it was simply far enough from his old life to feel safe. He'd started Pierce Construction with a business plan that would have impressed his former handlers. Every aspect designed for flexibility, security, and the kind of operational capabilities that most businessmen never needed to consider. The warehouse project had begun as a simple commercial venture, but Hugo's instincts had demanded more. Working with a carefully selected team of contractors who specialized in unusual requirements, he had created something extraordinary. From the outside, it looked like a standard industrial complex. Inside, it was a marvel of defensive architecture and strategic design. Reinforced concrete walls that could stop armor-piercing rounds. Multiple escape routes that weren't visible on any official blueprint. A communications center that could tap into any system in the city. Most importantly, surveillance capabilities that would put government facilities to shame. Hugo had told himself it was just paranoia, old habits from a man who'd spent too many years watching his back. But deep down, he'd known he was preparing for something. Some instinct, honed by years of survival, had whispered that his peaceful new life wouldn't last forever. Meeting Elena had been the closest thing to an accident in Hugo's carefully controlled existence. She'd literally run into him outside a coffee shop, spilling her drink across his suit and apologizing with the kind of genuine embarrassment that couldn't be faked. Her beauty had been obvious, but it was her apparent vulnerability that had drawn him in. Elena Osborne had claimed to be a struggling artist trying to make it in the big city. She'd grown up poor, she said, raised by a single father who'd worked multiple jobs to give her a chance at a better life. Hugo's protective instincts, dormant since leaving his old profession, had awakened with startling intensity. Their courtship had been a whirlwind. Elena was everything Hugo thought he wanted: beautiful, talented, and seemingly innocent of the darkness that had defined his previous existence. She'd been impressed by his success, but not consumed by it, content with quiet evenings and simple pleasures. When he'd proposed after 6 months, she'd cried tears that had seemed absolutely genuine. The wedding had been small, intimate. Elena's father Samuel had flown in from back east. She'd always been vague about exactly where. Hugo had been struck by the man's presence. Samuel Connell carried himself with the kind of controlled authority that Hugo recognized from his military days. But Elena had explained that her father was a successful businessman, accustomed to being in charge. What had truly impressed Hugo was Samuel's apparent concern for his daughter's happiness. The man had pulled Hugo aside during the reception, speaking with quiet intensity. "Elena is everything to me, son. You hurt her, and I'll make sure you regret it. But you make her happy, and you'll have my support forever." It was the kind of protective father speech that should have been touching. Instead, something in Samuel's eyes had made Hugo's instincts prick with unease. But Elena had been radiant, and Hugo had dismissed his concerns as old paranoia dying hard. The first few years of marriage had been blissful. Elena had thrown herself into supporting Hugo's business, hosting dinner parties for clients, and charming everyone she met. She'd seemed genuinely proud of his success, never questioning his long hours or frequent travel. When Hugo had told her about purchasing the warehouse property, she'd been enthusiastically supportive. "It's so exciting, seeing you build something from nothing," she'd said, wrapping her arms around him from behind as he studied the architectural plans. "You're like a modern pioneer, creating something permanent in this world." Hugo had been touched by her words, never suspecting that Elena was cataloging every detail of his business operations for reasons that had nothing to do with wifely interest. Now, as Hugo reviewed the timeline in his mind, he could see the subtle changes that had occurred over the past year. Elena's questions about his work had become more specific. Her casual inquiries about his daily schedule had grown more frequent. Most tellingly, she'd begun asking about the warehouse project with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to her usual level of interest in construction details. Standing in their bedroom, adjusting his cufflinks for dinner with Samuel, Hugo allowed himself to acknowledge what he'd been trying to ignore for months. His wife was not who she claimed to be. The question now was whether Elena's deception was simply a matter of concealed family connections, or if it represented something far more dangerous. As they walked to the car, Hugo's trained eye swept their surroundings with automatic precision. The quiet Gold Coast street looked peaceful, but Hugo noticed things that others missed. The sedan parked 3 blocks away with 2 occupants who'd been there for the past hour. The way their neighbors' curtains moved as if someone was watching from behind them. The subtle scuff marks on their front gate that suggested someone had been examining the lock mechanism. Someone was watching him. The only question was whether it was protection or surveillance. Hugo opened the car door for Elena, noting how her eyes darted to the same sedan he'd cataloged. Whatever game was being played, his wife was clearly a willing participant. As they drove towards Samuel Connell's Gold Coast penthouse, Hugo began mentally preparing for what might be his most important performance yet. Chapter 3. The Mask Slips. Samuel Connell's penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of one of Chicago's most exclusive buildings. Hugo had visited many times over the years, but tonight felt different. As the elevator rose to the 52nd floor, he noticed Elena's barely concealed tension, the slight tightness around her eyes, the way her fingers drummed silently against her purse. "You seem nervous," Hugo observed quietly. Elena's smile was immediate and bright. "Do I? I suppose I'm just excited. Daddy's been working on something big lately. I think he wants to bring you in as a partner on some projects." The elevator doors opened to reveal Samuel's lavish foyer. At 71, Elena's father remained an imposing figure, tall, silver-haired, with the kind of presence that commanded attention. He embraced Hugo with apparent warmth, but Hugo felt the subtle evaluation in the older man's grip, the way Samuel's eyes searched his face. "Hugo, my boy, you look prosperous. Construction business treating you well?" "Can't complain," Hugo replied, returning the handshake with precisely the right amount of pressure, enough to avoid seeming weak, not enough to suggest he was trying to prove anything. Dinner was an elegant affair served in Samuel's private dining room, which boasted floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. The conversation flowed smoothly over topics that seemed innocuous: Chicago politics, business trends, Elena's charity work. But Hugo's trained ear caught undercurrents that told a different story. Samuel's casual mentions of associates who'd had trouble with regulatory issues weren't random. His questions about Hugo's warehouse project were too specific, too focused on details that shouldn't matter to a casual observer. Most tellingly, Elena's responses were perfectly timed, as if she and her father had rehearsed this conversation. "You know, Hugo," Samuel said over dessert, "I've been thinking we should discuss some business opportunities. Real partnerships, not just family dinner conversations." Elena squeezed Hugo's hand encouragingly. "I told Daddy how brilliant you are with logistics and planning. He thinks you could be very valuable to his import operations." Hugo nodded thoughtfully, playing the role of the flattered son-in-law. "I appreciate the confidence, Samuel. What kind of operations are we talking about?" Samuel's smile was predatory. "Let's just say I deal in goods that require discretion, special handling, the kind of logistical challenges that a man with your skills might find profitable." It was an offer that any legitimate businessman would either politely decline or ask for more specific details about. Hugo didn't either. Instead, he leaned forward with apparent interest, allowing greed to flicker across his expression. "Profitable how?" he asked. "Very," Samuel replied. "But it would require absolute trust, complete discretion, and a willingness to bend certain rules." Hugo pretended to consider this, letting silence stretch for several seconds. Elena watched him intently, her grip on his hand tightening almost imperceptibly. "I need to know more," Hugo finally said. "But I'm interested." Samuel's satisfaction was obvious. "Excellent. I'll have some associates reach out to you next week. We'll start small, see how things go." As the evening wound down, Elena excused herself to use the powder room. The moment she was gone, Samuel's demeanor shifted completely. The jovial father-in-law disappeared, replaced by something much more dangerous. "Hugo," Samuel said quietly, "I hope you understand what you're agreeing to. This isn't some side business you can walk away from if you get cold feet." Hugo met the older man's stare steadily. "I appreciate the warning, Samuel, but I'm not a man who makes commitments lightly." "Good," Samuel nodded, "because men who disappoint me tend to have very short life expectancies." It was a threat delivered with casual efficiency, the kind of statement that had probably preceded numerous disappearances over the years. Hugo absorbed it without flinching, filing it away with all the other data points he'd been collecting about his father-in-law. Elena returned with perfect timing, her smile bright as she sensed the conclusion of their private conversation. "Are you two plotting world domination without me?" "Just business talk, sweetheart," Samuel replied, his grandfatherly mask sliding back into place. "Boring stuff that would put you to sleep." The drive home was quiet. Elena seemed pleased, humming softly as she watched the Chicago skyline scroll past. Hugo drove with automatic precision, his mind racing through possibilities and contingencies. Back at their Gold Coast mansion, Elena disappeared into her walk-in closet to change clothes. Hugo loosened his tie and moved to the window, ostensibly admiring their garden, but actually cataloging the positions of various surveillance points he'd noticed throughout the evening. That's when he heard it, Elena's voice, muffled but audible through the bathroom door. She was on the phone, and her tone was completely different from the loving wife who'd kissed him goodbye that morning. "I know, Daddy. He took the bait perfectly." "No, he doesn't suspect anything. The man's so arrogant, he actually thinks he's playing us." "What? Tomorrow night?" "Yes, the warehouse makes sense. He's been practically living there lately. He's a weakling who got lucky in business. Send your men to the warehouse tomorrow. Make it look like an accident." Hugo's blood went cold, but his expression never changed. Years of training had taught him to control his physical reactions even when his world was collapsing around him. He moved away from the bathroom door with the same casual pace he'd maintained all evening. Elena emerged from the bathroom in silk pajamas, her expression carefully arranged into loving concern. "You seem tired, darling." "Long day. Just thinking about your father's offer," Hugo replied, his voice betraying nothing of what he'd just learned. "It's a big decision." Elena moved to him, wrapping her arms around his waist with practiced affection. "I know Daddy can seem intimidating, but he really does care about our future. This could be the opportunity of a lifetime." Hugo kissed the top of her head, marveling at her performance. 10 years of marriage, and he'd never suspected that the woman in his arms was not only capable of planning his murder, but was actively looking forward to it. "You're right," he said softly. "It could change everything." As Elena drifted off to sleep beside him, Hugo stared at the ceiling and began to plan. The warehouse that Elena thought would be his tomb had been designed for exactly this kind of situation. Every defensive system, every hidden feature, every seemingly innocuous detail had been installed by a man who understood that enemies could come from anywhere, even from the woman who shared his bed. Tomorrow night, Samuel Connell's men would walk into what they expected to be a simple execution. Instead, they would find themselves in a carefully constructed trap designed by someone who had spent years staying alive in situations where others failed. Hugo smiled in the darkness. Elena was right about one thing. Tomorrow night would change everything. Chapter 4. The hunter becomes the hunted. Hugo woke before dawn, as he had every day for the past 15 years. Beside him, Elena slept peacefully, her face serene in the early morning light. Looking at her now, knowing what he knew, Hugo was struck by the completeness of her deception. Even in sleep, she maintained the mask of innocent vulnerability that had first attracted him. He dressed quietly and left for the office, but instead of heading to Pierce Construction, Hugo drove to a small, unremarkable building in an industrial district on the south side. To anyone watching, it would appear to be just another maintenance facility. In reality, it was something else entirely, a safe house Hugo had established during his first year in Chicago, equipped with resources that his legitimate business could never officially possess. The basement contained equipment that would have impressed his former government handlers: surveillance gear, communication devices, and computer systems capable of accessing databases that officially didn't exist. More importantly, it held detailed files on every person who had entered Hugo's orbit since his arrival in Chicago, including his wife and father-in-law. Hugo's investigation into Samuel Connell had begun 3 years ago, triggered by inconsistencies in Elena's stories about her childhood. What he discovered had been both impressive and terrifying. Samuel Connell wasn't just a criminal. He was the head of one of the Midwest's most sophisticated organized crime syndicates. The Connell family had built their empire on a foundation of violence and intimidation, but Samuel had evolved the operation far beyond traditional organized crime. They specialized in high-level import-export operations that served as fronts for everything from weapons trafficking to human smuggling. Their legitimate businesses provided perfect cover for money laundering on an international scale. Most disturbing of all, Hugo had learned that Elena wasn't Samuel's daughter by birth. She was an adopted asset, recruited as a teenager and trained specifically for long-term infiltration operations. Elena Osborne was a completely fabricated identity, designed to snare wealthy marks who could be useful to the Connell organization. Hugo had been her longest assignment, 10 years of patient cultivation, waiting for the right moment to either recruit him or eliminate him. Last night's dinner had apparently been the decision point, and Hugo's apparent eagerness to join Samuel's operation had sealed his fate. He was too dangerous to recruit, which meant he had to die. The irony was exquisite. Elena and Samuel believed they were dealing with a soft businessman who'd gotten lucky in construction. They had no idea they were planning to murder one of the most lethal individuals ever trained by the U.S. government. Hugo spent the morning reviewing surveillance footage from cameras he'd discreetly installed around a warehouse complex months ago. Samuel's reconnaissance had been thorough, but predictable. Teams of two-man units cataloging entry points, sight lines, and security measures. They'd identified the warehouse's apparent vulnerabilities and were planning their attack accordingly. What they hadn't identified were the modifications Hugo had made that weren't visible on any blueprint. The warehouse looked like a standard industrial facility, but every wall, corridor, and room had been designed with defensive capabilities that would make a military installation envious. At noon, Hugo's secure phone rang, a device that Elena had never seen and which couldn't be traced to any official records. The caller was Roberto Watts, a former Marine sniper who'd served with Hugo on 2 classified operations before retiring to private security work. "Hugo, I got a message. You sure about this?" "Completely sure," Hugo replied. "How quickly can you get here?" "I'm already in town. Been watching your 6 since yesterday, like you requested. And brother, you've got serious heat building. I count at least 8 vehicles conducting surveillance on your various properties." Roberto was one of 3 former colleagues Hugo had discreetly contacted over the past year, men who owed him their lives and who could be trusted absolutely. The others, Chad Hess, a demolitions expert, and Mark Benjamin, a communications specialist, had arrived in Chicago under various pretexts during the past month. Hugo had told himself he was just being paranoid, preparing for threats that would never materialize. Now, his paranoia was about to save his life. "Roberto, I need you to coordinate with Chad and Mark. Full operational readiness by 1800 hours. And Roberto, this one's personal. Copy that. What's the target profile?" "Organized crime syndicate. 8 to 12 hostiles, professionally trained but overconfident. They're expecting to eliminate a soft civilian target. Roberto's laugh was grim. They have no idea what they're walking into, do they? None whatsoever. Hugo spent the afternoon at his legitimate office, maintaining his normal routine while secretly coordinating with his team. Rebecca Lamb had worked for him for 5 years and had proven herself utterly reliable, but Hugo had never told her about his past or his preparations for situations like this. As far as she knew, her boss was simply a successful businessman with unusually good instincts about people. "Mr. Pierce," Rebecca said during their afternoon briefing, "your wife called. She wanted to confirm that you'd be working late at the warehouse tonight." Hugo smiled. Elena was making sure he'd be exactly where Samuel's men expected to find him. "Did she seem concerned about my schedule?" "Actually, yes. She sounded almost excited, but she was trying to hide it." Rebecca was more perceptive than she knew. Elena probably was excited. This was the culmination of a decade-long operation, and she was about to collect a substantial reward for successfully eliminating a target. At 5 p.m., Hugo left the office and drove to the warehouse complex. To any observer, he appeared to be simply another businessman putting in extra hours on an important project. He parked in his usual spot, used his key card to enter through the main entrance, and proceeded to his temporary office on the second floor. What the watchers couldn't see was the subtle but comprehensive transformation taking place throughout the building. Chad Hess had spent the day activating defensive systems that had been dormant for months. Mark Benjamin was establishing secure communications with law enforcement contacts who would be needed later. Roberto Watts had positioned himself in the building's hidden observation post, for which he could monitor all approaches to the facility. At 7 p.m., Hugo's personal phone buzzed with a text from Elena. "Working late again? Don't forget to eat something. Love you." The message was perfectly crafted, loving concern with just enough specificity to confirm Hugo's location for the attack team. Hugo responded with equal care. "Just finishing up some paperwork. Home by 10. It was a promise he intended to keep, though not in the way Elena expected. As darkness fell over Chicago, Hugo Pierce prepared to become something he'd hoped never to be again. A predator hunting other predators. The warehouse had been designed as his fortress. Tonight, it would become their tomb. Chapter 5. The Art of War. At 8:47 p.m., Hugo's surveillance system detected the first vehicle approaching the warehouse complex. A black SUV with tinted windows moved slowly past the main entrance before continuing to a position 3 blocks away. 7 minutes later, a second vehicle took up position on the opposite side of the building. Hugo watched the feed from his command center, a concealed room that officially didn't exist on any blueprint. The space resembled something from a spy thriller. Multiple monitors displaying real-time surveillance from dozens of hidden cameras, communication equipment that could intercept and redirect virtually any signal in the city, and tactical displays showing the positions of all incoming threats. "We've got movement," Roberto's voice crackled through Hugo's earpiece. Roberto was positioned in the building's hidden sniper nest, disguised as routine ventilation equipment on the roof. 8 hostiles confirmed, professional loadout. They're staging for a coordinated assault. Hugo nodded, studying the thermal imaging displays. Samuel's men were good. They moved with the disciplined precision of military veterans, and their equipment was top grade. Under normal circumstances, they would be more than capable of eliminating a civilian target. But these weren't normal circumstances. "Chad, report," Hugo whispered into his throat microphone. "Defensive systems are fully operational," Chad Hess replied from his position in the building's hidden sub-basement. "All entry points are monitored and controlled. I've got enough surprises rigged to stop a small army." Mark Benjamin's voice joined the conversation from the building's communication center. "I've got full electronic surveillance on their equipment. They're using tactical radios, night vision, and what looks like standard breach and clear loadouts. No heavy weapons detected." Hugo smiled grimly. Samuel's men had prepared for a simple execution, not a military engagement. They'd brought enough firepower to kill a businessman, but they were walking into a facility designed to withstand assault by trained professionals. The attack began at exactly 9:15 p.m. The first team approached the main entrance, moving with textbook precision. They'd identified the building's security cameras and believed they were avoiding detection. What they didn't know was that Hugo's real surveillance system was completely separate from the obvious security measures, hidden in ways that would never occur to conventional thinking. Hugo watched as the lead man knelt beside the main door, working on the electronic lock with professional efficiency. The lock disengaged after 30 seconds, exactly as Hugo had programmed it to do. He wanted them inside the building, where his advantages would be absolute. Team 1 is in the building, Roberto reported. 4 hostiles, moving toward the main stairwell. Simultaneously, the second team was breaching the loading dock on the building's east side. Their entry was equally smooth, exactly as Hugo had intended. Both teams were now inside his carefully constructed maze, moving toward what they believed was an unsuspecting target. Hugo activated the building's hidden sound system, filling the corridors with the subtle noise of a man working alone, typing on a keyboard, shuffling papers, occasionally clearing his throat. To the approaching assassins, it would sound like their target was obliviously focused on work, completely unaware of his impending death. The first team reached the second floor, moving through corridors that seemed standard but had been designed with specific tactical considerations. Every corner provided cover for defenders while exposing attackers. Every sight line had been calculated to maximize defensive advantages. Hugo's command center displays showed both teams converging on his supposed location. A second-floor office where lights burned brightly behind carefully arranged silhouettes that suggested a man working late. Both teams are in position, Mark reported. They're preparing for synchronized breach in 30 seconds. Hugo took a deep breath, feeling the familiar calm that came with the transition from planning to action. For 10 years, he'd been Hugo Pierce, successful businessman and loving husband. Tonight, he was something else entirely, a predator who'd spent years learning to hunt the most dangerous game on Earth. Execute, Hugo whispered. The building's lights went out instantly, plunging both assault teams into complete darkness. Emergency lighting flickered on after 3 seconds, casting everything in an eerie red glow that destroyed night vision adaptation while providing just enough illumination for Hugo's thermal imaging systems. Simultaneously, electromagnetic pulse devices hidden throughout the building activated, frying the attacker's electronic equipment. Night vision goggles, tactical radios, and electronic weapon sights became useless in an instant. What the hell? The voice cut off abruptly as the building's acoustic warfare system activated. Speakers hidden in the walls began broadcasting a carefully modulated sound frequency that caused disorientation and nausea in anyone not wearing the specially designed ear protection that Hugo and his team had prepared. The first team, caught in the middle of their breach attempt, found themselves stumbling in near darkness while waves of vertigo made coordinated movement impossible. The second team, approaching from the loading dock, fared no better. They were trapped in a corridor that Hugo had designed specifically to channel attackers into a kill zone. Roberto, you have targets, Hugo said calmly. Confirmed. Engaging. The sniper's first shot took down Team 1's leader with professional precision. The suppressed rifle made almost no sound, but the effect was immediate. The remaining 3 men found themselves leaderless and effectively blind, trapped in an environment designed to neutralize their training and equipment. Hugo moved through the building using passages that existed only on his private blueprints. The warehouse had been constructed with a hidden network of corridors, observation points, and fighting positions that allowed him to appear anywhere within the structure without being detected. He emerged from a concealed doorway behind the second team, moving with a fluid silence that had kept him alive during years of covert operations. These men were professionals, but they'd never faced someone with Hugo's specific skill set. The first man never knew what hit him. Hugo's knife found the gap between helmet and body armor with surgical precision, and the man dropped without a sound. The second assassin turned at his partner's sudden collapse, only to find Hugo already inside his defensive perimeter. The fight lasted less than 10 seconds. Hugo had been trained by the best killers in the world, and he'd learned his lessons well. When it was over, 2 more of Samuel's men were dead, and Hugo was already moving toward the next target. Status report, Hugo said quietly. Team 1 neutralized, Roberto replied. 4 down, no survivors. Team 2 neutralized, Hugo confirmed. 2 down, 2 wounded and secured. Chad's voice crackled through the comm system. Building secured. No additional hostiles detected. In less than 15 minutes, Samuel Connell's carefully planned assassination had become a massacre. 8 professional killers had walked into Hugo's warehouse expecting to murder a civilian businessman. Instead, they'd encountered something they were completely unprepared for. A man who'd spent years learning to kill people exactly like them. Hugo stood in his command center, studying the tactical displays that showed the complete failure of Samuel's operation. The 2 surviving attackers were secured in a holding area that Hugo had designed for exactly this purpose. A place where people could be questioned without any possibility of escape or outside interference. His secure phone buzzed with an incoming call. Elena's name appeared on the display. "Hello, sweetheart," Hugo answered calmly. "Hugo, thank God you're all right. I just heard on the news that there was some kind of incident at an industrial complex on the south side. It wasn't your warehouse, was it?" Elena's performance was flawless. Exactly the right mixture of concern and relief that a loving wife would display upon learning her husband was safe. Hugo could picture her now, probably sitting with Samuel, both of them expecting to hear that Hugo Pierce was dead. "No, darling, not my warehouse. I'm fine, just finishing up some paperwork. I should be home in an hour or so." "Thank goodness. I was so worried when I saw the news reports. They're saying multiple casualties, but no details yet." "I'm sure it's nothing to concern us," Hugo replied. "Just some industrial accident. I'll see you soon." Hugo ended the call and smiled. Elena and Samuel were about to learn that their decade-long game had come to an end. But first, Hugo had some questions that needed answers, and 2 survivors who were going to provide them whether they wanted to or not. Chapter 6: Extraction and Revelation. The interrogation room in Hugo's warehouse had been designed with the clinical efficiency of a medical facility combined with the psychological impact of a medieval dungeon. Soundproof walls, controlled lighting, and restraint systems that made escape impossible. It was a place where truth could be extracted from even the most reluctant subjects. The first survivor, a man in his 30s with the build and bearing of an ex-military operative, had regained consciousness 20 minutes after the failed assault. Hugo studied him through one-way glass, noting details that told a professional story. Military tattoos, scar patterns consistent with overseas deployment, the kind of physical conditioning that came from years of serious training. Name's Jesse Gregory, Mark Benjamin reported, reading from a tablet connected to facial recognition software. Former Army Rangers, 3 tours in Afghanistan, honorable discharge 5 years ago. Since then, he's been working private security for various clients. All of them connected to Samuel Connell. Hugo asked. "Looks like it. Financial records show regular payments from shell companies that trace back to Connell Enterprises." Hugo nodded. Samuel had been recruiting military veterans, offering them good pay for work that probably seemed routine until tonight. Jesse Gregory had likely believed he was participating in some kind of corporate security operation, not a planned murder. Hugo entered the interrogation room wearing a simple black suit and carrying a manila folder. To Jesse's eyes, he would appear to be exactly what Elena believed him to be, a successful businessman who'd somehow found himself in an impossible situation. "Mr. Gregory," Hugo said pleasantly, settling into a chair across from the restrained man. "I apologize for the circumstances, but I need to ask you some questions." Jesse's response was exactly what Hugo expected from a professional: name, rank, and serial number. The man had been trained to resist interrogation, and he was following his training. Hugo smiled and opened the manila folder, revealing photographs that made Jesse's face go pale. Pictures of his apartment, his girlfriend, his elderly parents in their retirement community in Florida. Most damning of all, financial records showing exactly how much Samuel Connell had been paying him over the past 18 months. "I'm not here to hurt you, Jesse," Hugo said quietly. I'm here to offer you a choice. You can continue working for a man who sent you into a death trap without warning you what you were really facing, or you can help me ensure that Samuel Connell never puts another soldier in harm's way. Jesse's military bearing cracked slightly. You're not just some construction guy, are you? No, Hugo replied simply. I'm not. The conversation that followed was professional and efficient. Jesse Gregory was a good soldier who'd been lied to and manipulated by people he trusted. Hugo had encountered dozens of men like Jesse during his covert years, veterans struggling to find purpose in civilian life, willing to take questionable jobs because they needed to support families and didn't know where else to turn. By the time Hugo finished explaining the real nature of Samuel Connell's operation, Jesse was ready to cooperate fully. Jesus Christ, Jesse muttered, staring at evidence of human trafficking operations, weapons smuggling, and multiple murders. I thought we were just doing corporate security work. Connell said you were embezzling from his daughter, that we were just supposed to scare you. And the other man with you tonight? Same story. We were all told you were some white-collar criminal who needed to be taught a lesson. Nobody said anything about killing you. Hugo believed him. Samuel was too smart to recruit soldiers by advertising murder contracts. He would have spun a story that made his targets seem deserving of whatever fate awaited them. The second survivor, a younger man named Kyle Dodson, provided similar information. Both men had been deceived about the true nature of their mission, and both were horrified to learn they'd been working for one of the Midwest's most ruthless criminal organizations. Hugo made them both an offer: disappear forever with enough money to start new lives, or stay and help him bring down Samuel Connell's entire operation. Both men chose to stay. At 11:30 p.m., Hugo finally left the warehouse and drove home to his Gold Coast mansion. He'd spent the past hour coordinating with Roberto, Chad, and Mark to ensure that all evidence of the evening's events was properly cleaned up. By morning, it would appear that 8 men had simply vanished without a trace. A mystery that would never be solved because there would be no bodies to find and no witnesses to question. Elena was waiting in their living room, wearing a silk nightgown and holding a glass of wine. Her relief upon seeing him alive was perfectly performed, though Hugo could now detect the microscopic tells that revealed her true emotions. The slight tension around her eyes, the barely perceptible tightness in her voice, the way her hands trembled almost imperceptibly as she embraced him. I was so worried, she whispered against his chest. When you didn't come home by 10, I started imagining all sorts of terrible things. Just took longer than expected, Hugo replied, stroking her hair with apparent affection. You know how these big projects can be. They went to bed together, Elena curling against him with a practiced intimacy of 10 years of marriage. Hugo lay awake listening to her breathing, marveling at her self-control. Her father's carefully planned operation had failed catastrophically. 8 men were dead, and she had no way of knowing what had gone wrong. Yet she maintained her loving wife performance with Oscar-worthy skill. But Hugo could feel the tension in her body, the way she never quite relaxed in his sleep. Elena was waiting for something, probably a phone call from Samuel that would never come. At 3:17 a.m., Elena's phone buzzed with a text message. Hugo felt her body tense as she carefully retrieved the device, trying not to wake him. In the darkness, he watched her read the message, saw her face go pale in the phone's dim glow. The message was brief: package not delivered. No word from delivery team. Advise. Elena stared at the message for a long moment, then typed a reply. We'll investigate in the morning. May need alternate approach. She deleted both messages and returned the phone to the nightstand, then lay back down beside Hugo. But sleep was clearly impossible now. Elena's mind was racing, trying to process the implications of her father's failed operation. Hugo could almost hear her thoughts. How had 8 professional killers failed to murder one civilian businessman? Where were Samuel's men? What had gone wrong? By dawn, Elena would start making calls, trying to piece together what had happened at the warehouse. She would discover that Hugo Pierce had somehow survived an attack that should have been impossible to escape. More troubling, she would learn that Samuel's assault team had vanished completely, leaving no trace of their fate. Within hours, Elena and Samuel would begin to suspect that their carefully constructed, decade-long operation had been compromised from the beginning. They would start to wonder whether the mild-mannered construction executive they'd been playing might actually be something else entirely. Hugo smiled in the darkness. Let them wonder. Let them worry. Let them begin to understand that they had made a terrible mistake in choosing him as their target. Tomorrow, the real game would begin. Chapter 7. The Hunter's Web. Elena left early the next morning, claiming a last-minute appointment with her yoga instructor. Hugo watched from the bedroom window as she drove away in her white BMW, noting the careful way she checked her mirrors and the route she chose. Not toward the health club she usually frequented, but toward the industrial district where Samuel Connell maintained his legitimate business operations. Hugo had been expecting this. Elena needed to report the previous night's failure in person, and she needed to help Samuel figure out what had gone wrong. What neither of them suspected was that Hugo had spent the past year preparing for this exact scenario. At 9 a.m., Hugo arrived at his office and conducted business as usual. Rebecca Lamb brought him coffee and the morning reports, commenting on how well-rested he looked despite working so late the previous evening. "You seem particularly energetic today, Mr. Pierce," she observed. "The warehouse project must be going well." "Very well," Hugo replied. "Better than expected, actually." What Rebecca didn't know was that Hugo's real work was being conducted through encrypted channels that had nothing to do with Pierce Construction. Over the past 18 months, he'd been building a comprehensive intelligence network focused on Samuel Connell's criminal empire. Every associate, every business front, every financial transaction had been cataloged and analyzed. Hugo had done more than just investigate Samuel Connell. He'd infiltrated the man's organization at every level. The first penetration had been achieved through Gerald Anderson, a former CIA analyst who'd retired to Chicago and opened a consulting firm that specialized in corporate security research. Gerald's clients included several companies that did legitimate business with Connell Enterprises, providing the perfect cover for intelligence gathering. The second penetration came through Eric Barr, a former DEA agent who'd established himself as a freelance investigator specializing in insurance fraud. Eric's services had been requested by insurance companies that covered several of Samuel's shipping operations, giving him access to detailed financial records and shipping manifests. The third and most valuable penetration had been achieved through Stuart Riley, a former military intelligence officer who'd opened a private security firm that provided services to several businesses in Samuel's sphere of influence. Stuart's men had been providing security for Connell-affiliated companies for over a year, giving Hugo real-time intelligence on Samuel's most sensitive operations. By 10 a.m., Hugo had confirmation that Elena had indeed met with her father at his waterfront office complex. Surveillance footage showed her arriving alone and departing 2 hours later, her body language suggesting extreme agitation. At noon, Samuel Connell made 3 phone calls that Hugo's communication intercepts captured in their entirety. The first call was to a contact in the Chicago Police Department asking about any incidents at industrial facilities on the South Side. The second was to a private investigator requesting immediate background research on Hugo Pierce. The third was to someone Samuel addressed only as the Colonel, asking for specialists who could handle unusual circumstances. Hugo smiled as he listened to the recordings. Samuel was beginning to understand that he was dealing with something outside his experience, and he was calling in heavier resources. But Samuel's network, impressive as it was, had been compromised from the beginning. The colonel was actually Colonel George Owens Rhett, a former Army Special Forces officer who'd gone private after retiring from the service. What Samuel didn't know was that Colonel Owens owed Hugo Pierce a debt that could never be repaid. Hugo had saved Owens' life during a classified operation in Syria 8 years earlier. Hugo's secure phone rang at 2:47 p.m. "Hugo, this is George. I just got a very interesting call from Samuel Connell. He's asking me to provide specialists for what he describes as an unusual security problem. Should I be concerned about you?" "Not concerned, George, but definitely interested." "What kind of specialists is he requesting?" "The kind that specialize in making problems disappear permanently." He's offering serious money for people with very specific skill sets. Hugo considered this. Samuel was escalating quickly, moving from conventional criminals to military-grade specialists. It was exactly the kind of response Hugo had hoped to provoke. "George, I need a favor. A big one. After what you did for me in Syria, name it. I need you to accept Samuel's contract. Bring your best people, but understand, they'll be working for me, not him." George was quiet for several seconds. "You're asking me to run a false flag operation against a civilian. This isn't some foreign theater, Hugo. This is Chicago. Samuel Connell isn't a civilian, George. He's the head of a criminal organization responsible for dozens of murders, human trafficking, and weapons smuggling. I can provide you with evidence that will convince you this is a legitimate target." Another pause. "Send me the files. If they check out, you got my team. But Hugo, this is the last time. After this, we're even." "Understood." "And George?" "Thank you." By 6 p.m., Colonel Owens had reviewed Hugo's intelligence files and agreed to provide support. His team would pose as freelance specialists while actually gathering intelligence and providing Hugo with real-time information about Samuel's plans. Elena returned home at 7:30 p.m., her usual radiant smile replaced by barely concealed tension. She kissed Hugo with apparent affection, but he could feel the calculation behind her touch. "How was your day, darling?" she asked. "Productive. Yours?" "Oh, the usual. Lunch with friends, some shopping." Elena moved to the bar and poured herself a glass of wine with hands that trembled slightly. "Actually, I heard something disturbing today. One of the girls mentioned that there was some kind of incident at an industrial complex last night, near where your warehouse is located." Hugo looked up from his newspaper with carefully calibrated concern. "Really? What kind of incident?" She wasn't sure. Something about missing persons, maybe? The police were apparently asking questions all morning. This was Elena's attempt to gauge whether Hugo knew anything about the previous night's events. Her performance was skilled, but Hugo could read the real questions behind her words. "What do you know? How much do you suspect? Are we compromised?" "That's concerning," Hugo replied. "I hope it doesn't affect our project timeline." Elena studied his face intently, looking for any sign that her mild-mannered husband might be something other than what he appeared. Hugo gave her nothing, the same calm competence he displayed for 10 years of marriage. But internally, Hugo was preparing for the next phase of his operation. Samuel and Elena had revealed themselves as enemies. Colonel Owens' team would soon be providing intelligence on Samuel's network. The two surviving members of the previous night's assault team were now working for Hugo, providing him with detailed knowledge of Samuel's security procedures and operational methods. Most importantly, Hugo had spent the day activating resources that Elena and Samuel didn't know existed. Former colleagues from his covert years, people who owed him favors or simply respected his expertise. Men and women who could disappear problems or create new ones, depending on what the situation required. Elena and Samuel believed they were dealing with one man who'd gotten lucky. They were actually facing a network of professionals who'd spent years learning to eliminate threats that conventional law enforcement couldn't touch. As Elena excused herself to take a bath, claiming she had a headache, Hugo made a decision that would have surprised his former handlers. He wasn't going to simply eliminate Samuel Connell and his organization. He was going to dismantle them piece by piece, ensuring that every victim of their crimes received justice and every criminal in their network faced consequences. It would take time, patience, and resources that most people couldn't imagine. But Hugo Pierce had all three in abundance. The war was about to begin in earnest. Chapter 8, The Perfect Storm. The next 72 hours unfolded with the precision of a military campaign. Hugo had spent years learning to orchestrate complex operations where timing was everything, and this situation demanded all of his expertise. On Thursday morning, Colonel George Owens met with Samuel Connell at the Connell family's waterfront headquarters. Hugo listened to their conversation through surveillance equipment that Stuart Riley's security team had installed weeks earlier. "Mr. Connell," George said, his military bearing lending credibility to his cover story, "I understand you have a problem that requires specialized attention. Samuel's voice carried the kind of controlled tension that came from dealing with a crisis he didn't fully understand. I need someone eliminated. Quietly, professionally, and with no possibility of the job being traced back to my organization. That's expensive work, George replied, and it requires specific information about the target. What makes this individual so dangerous that conventional methods have failed? There was a pause before Samuel answered. Yesterday, 8 of my best men attempted to eliminate this target. They were professionals, former military, experienced in this kind of work. None of them returned. We found no bodies, no evidence of what happened, no trace of their fate. Hugo smiled as he listened. Samuel was beginning to grasp the magnitude of his problem, but he still had no idea what he was really facing. That's unusual, George admitted. What do you know about your target? His name is Hugo Pierce. He owns a construction company, married to my daughter for 10 years. We believe he was just a successful businessman who'd stumbled onto some of our operations. Now I'm starting to think we may have been mistaken. George's next question was perfectly calibrated. What makes you suspect he's more than he appears? Instinct, Samuel replied, and the fact that 8 trained killers walked into what should have been a simple execution and vanished without a trace. That doesn't happen to soft, civilian targets. The meeting concluded with George agreeing to conduct surveillance on Hugo while assembling a team capable of handling whatever they might encounter. Samuel agreed to pay triple the usual rate, plus a substantial bonus for discretion. What Samuel didn't know was that George's team would be gathering intelligence for Hugo while providing him with real-time information about Samuel's activities and plans. Friday brought the first phase of Hugo's counterattack. Gerald Anderson's corporate security research firm released a detailed report on suspicious shipping activities connected to Connell Enterprises. The report, ostensibly prepared for an insurance company concerned about cargo theft, actually contained evidence of weapons smuggling that Gerald forwarded to federal authorities. Simultaneously, Eric Barr's insurance fraud investigation uncovered financial irregularities in several Connell-affiliated businesses. Bank records showing unusual cash transactions, shipping manifests that didn't match customs declarations, and insurance claims that suggested systematic criminal activity. This evidence also found its way to appropriate federal agencies. By Friday afternoon, Samuel Connell's legitimate business operations were under scrutiny from the FBI, DEA, and Customs Service. Phone calls were being monitored, financial records were being subpoenaed, and surveillance teams were being deployed. Samuel had no idea that his enemy was orchestrating this law enforcement attention, whether Hugo had spent months preparing a comprehensive case that would survive legal scrutiny. Saturday morning brought Elena to Hugo's warehouse complex. She arrived alone, claiming she wanted to see the project that had been consuming so much of her husband's time. Hugo gave her a tour of the facilities, noting how carefully she observed details that had nothing to do with construction work. Elena was looking for evidence of what had happened Monday night. Bloodstains, bullet holes, any sign that a battle had taken place in this seemingly ordinary industrial building. She found nothing, because Hugo's cleanup had been thorough and professional. But Elena's visit served Hugo's purposes perfectly. Her presence at the warehouse was recorded by surveillance equipment that would later provide evidence of her involvement in the conspiracy against him. More importantly, Elena's behavior during the tour revealed the extent of her training. She moved through the building with the careful awareness of someone conducting tactical reconnaissance, noted sight lines and defensive positions with the eye of a professional, and asked questions that no innocent spouse would think to pose. "This is quite a fortress you've built, darling," she commented as they concluded the tour. "All these security features seem rather elaborate for a warehouse." "Chicago's a rough city," Hugo replied. "Better to be prepared than sorry." Elena smiled, but Hugo could see the calculation behind her eyes. She was beginning to suspect that her husband's warehouse was more than it appeared, but she couldn't figure out how a civilian businessman would know to design such sophisticated defensive measures. That evening, Elena made a series of phone calls that Hugo's communication intercepts captured in their entirety. The first call was to Samuel. "Daddy, I toured Hugo's warehouse today. The place is built like a fortress. Military-grade security, defensive positions, things that don't make sense for a normal business operation. Samuel's response revealed his growing concern. That confirms what I've been thinking. Your husband isn't what he appears to be. What do you want me to do? Nothing yet. I've got serious professionals working on this now. Former special forces, the kind of people who can handle unusual circumstances. We'll know more soon. The second call was to someone Elena addressed only as handler, a conversation that made Hugo's blood run cold. The target is proving more complex than anticipated, Elena reported. His operational security suggests professional training. Request guidance on contingency protocols. The voice that answered was electronically distorted, but the words were clear. Maintain cover at all costs. If your position is compromised, activate termination protocols and extract immediately. This call revealed something that changed everything. Elena wasn't just Samuel's adopted daughter and trained asset. She was also connected to a larger organization, one that operated with the kind of sophistication that suggested government or intelligence community involvement. Hugo had assumed he was dealing with organized crime, but Elena's handler suggested something more complex and dangerous. Sunday morning, Hugo implemented the next phase of his operation. Using resources and contacts that officially didn't exist, Hugo arranged for Jesse Gregory and Kyle Dodson, the two survivors from Monday night's attack, to surrender to federal authorities. Their testimony, combined with the evidence that Hugo's network had been gathering, painted a comprehensive picture of Samuel Connell's criminal empire. More importantly, both men testified that they'd been recruited for what they were told was a corporate security operation, only to discover they were actually participating in attempted murder. Their testimony provided federal prosecutors with evidence of conspiracy, racketeering, and multiple felonies. By Sunday evening, Samuel Connell was facing federal indictments on charges that would put him in prison for the rest of his life. But Hugo wasn't finished. Elena's connection to unknown handlers meant that eliminating Samuel wouldn't end the threat. Hugo needed to identify and neutralize everyone who posed a danger to his continued existence. Monday morning brought the final revelation. Colonel George Owens reported that his surveillance of Hugo had uncovered something extraordinary. Your target isn't just professionally trained, Hugo. He's conducting counter-surveillance operations that would impress military intelligence specialists. Whoever this guy is, he's not a civilian. Samuel's response was immediate. Find out everything you can about Hugo Pierce. Real background, not the fabricated identity we've been looking at. I need to know what we're really dealing with. George's investigation, actually coordinated with Hugo, revealed carefully crafted intelligence suggesting that Hugo Pierce might be a former government operative living under deep cover. The revelation terrified Samuel, who suddenly understood that he'd been targeting someone with the skills and resources to destroy his entire organization. But the revelation also activated Elena's termination protocols. That evening, as Hugo returned home from his office, he found Elena packing a suitcase with methodical efficiency. Going somewhere, darling? He asked calmly. Elena's mask finally slipped completely. The loving wife disappeared, replaced by the cold professional she'd always been underneath. It's over, Hugo, she said without looking at him. Whatever game you've been playing, whatever you really are, it ends now. Hugo sat down in their bedroom chair, completely relaxed. Actually, Elena, it's just beginning. She turned to face him, and Hugo saw something in her eyes that he recognized from his covert years. The look of a predator who'd suddenly realized she was the prey. You've known, she said. It wasn't a question. For quite some time, Hugo confirmed. The question now is whether you want to disappear quietly or whether you'd prefer to explain your decade-long operation to the federal agents who are currently surrounding this house. Elena's hand moved toward her purse, where Hugo knew she kept a weapon. She was fast, professionally trained, and desperate. But Hugo was faster. Chapter 9, Endgame. The confrontation in Hugo's bedroom lasted exactly 11 seconds. Elena's hand had barely touched her purse when Hugo moved with the fluid precision of someone who'd spent years training for moments exactly like this. Her weapon, a compact 9mm pistol that she'd concealed with characteristic thoroughness, never cleared the purse. When it was over, Elena sat on the floor with her hands zip-tied behind her back, staring at her husband with a mixture of rage and grudging professional respect. "Whoever you really are," she said quietly, "you're very good at this." Hugo retrieved Elena's weapon and checked it with automatic efficiency. "I had excellent teachers. CIA, military special operations, private contractors. Does it matter now?" Elena studied his face with the careful attention of someone who'd spent years reading people for a living. "It matters because I need to know whether my handlers are going to consider you worth eliminating or whether they'll write this operation off as acceptable losses." Hugo smiled. "Your handlers have bigger problems to worry about than me." As if summoned by his words, the sound of vehicles arriving filled the quiet Gold Coast street. Elena's expression went from controlled resignation to genuine fear. "You call the FBI?" she said. "Among others," Hugo confirmed. What Elena didn't know was that Hugo had spent the past week coordinating with multiple federal agencies to ensure that Samuel Connell's entire organization would be dismantled simultaneously. FBI agents were raiding Samuel's businesses and residences. DEA units were seizing drug shipments and financial assets. Customs agents were arresting associates at airports and shipping facilities. Most importantly, Hugo had provided federal authorities with evidence that Samuel's organization had been involved in weapons trafficking that threatened national security. This evidence guaranteed that Elena and Samuel would face terrorism-related charges that carried life sentences without possibility of parole. The front door opened, and Special Agent Rebecca Lamb entered the bedroom with her service weapon drawn. Hugo's assistant of 5 years removed her earpiece and revealed the FBI credentials she'd been carrying since the day she started working for him. "Hugo Pierce," she said formally, "you're under arrest for multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, and violations of federal firearms regulations." Elena's eyes widened as she realized the final dimension of Hugo's operation. Even his arrest was part of the plan. "However," Agent Lamb continued, "given your cooperation with federal authorities and your status as a protected witness, you'll be released pending further investigation." Hugo submitted to handcuffs for the benefit of any surveillance that might be monitoring the situation, knowing he'd be released within hours. His apparent arrest would satisfy Elena's handlers that justice had been served, while actually providing him with federal protection and a new official identity. Elena, on the other hand, was read her actual rights and charged with conspiracy, attempted murder, fraud, and numerous other federal crimes. As agents led her from the house, she turned back to look at Hugo one final time. "This isn't over," she said quietly. "There are others who won't forget what happened here." Hugo met her gaze steadily. "Let them come." 3 days later, Hugo sat in a federal courthouse listening as Elena Osborne Pierce and Samuel Connell were sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. The evidence against them was overwhelming, and their connections to international criminal networks had elevated their crimes to the level of national security threats. Samuel had aged a decade in the past week, his silver hair now completely white and his commanding presence reduced to that of a broken old man. He'd realized too late that his decision to target Hugo Pierce had destroyed everything he'd spent 40 years building. Elena maintained her composure throughout the sentencing, but Hugo could see the fury burning behind her professional mask. She'd spent 10 years cultivating him as an asset, only to discover that she'd been the one being played the entire time. After the sentencing, Hugo met with federal prosecutors to finalize his witness protection arrangements. His cooperation had been invaluable in dismantling not just Samuel's organization, but also the larger network of criminal enterprises they'd been connected to. "What happens now?" asked the lead prosecutor, a serious woman in her 40s who'd been impressed by the comprehensiveness of Hugo's intelligence gathering. "Now I disappear again," Hugo replied. "New identity, new location, new life. Any preferences for where you'd like to relocate?" Hugo considered this. "Somewhere quiet. Somewhere I can build things without having to worry about who might be watching." 6 months later, a man named Roland Dunham purchased a small construction company in a mountain town in Colorado. He was a quiet, competent businessman who specialized in security-conscious residential construction for clients who valued privacy and protection. The townspeople found Roland friendly but private, someone who contributed to local charities and supported community projects without seeking attention or recognition. He dated occasionally, but never seemed serious about anyone, claiming that his last relationship had ended badly and he wasn't ready to trust someone new. What the townspeople didn't know was that Roland's modest house on the outskirts of town contained security features that would have impressed military installations, or that he maintained contact with a network of former colleagues who could provide assistance if his new peaceful existence was ever threatened. Sometimes, late at night when he couldn't sleep, Roland would think about Elena and Samuel, spending their remaining years in maximum security federal prisons. He'd wonder if Elena's mysterious handlers would ever attempt revenge, or if the destruction of Samuel's organization had sent a clear enough message to discourage further interest in his activities. But mostly, Roland Dunham focused on building his new life, one day at a time, always prepared for threats that might never come. After all, he'd learned from the best teachers that the price of peace was eternal vigilance. And if anyone ever made the mistake of threatening his quiet mountain existence, they would discover that Roland Dunham possessed skills that no small-town construction contractor should ever need. The warehouse in Chicago had been demolished, its secrets buried with the concrete that filled its foundations. But Roland carried its lessons with him, that trust must be earned, that enemies could wear the faces of loved ones, and that sometimes the only way to find peace was to be prepared for war. In the mountains of Colorado, surrounded by peaks that had stood unchanged for millennia, Roland Dunham built his fortress and waited to see if the world would leave him alone. So far it had, but he remained ready for the day it might not.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.